Have you ever sat quietly and suddenly felt observed? Not by someone else, but by something within you? A subtle presence, a quiet voice, a watcher behind your thoughts. You notice your breath. A feeling arises. Then another thought joins in. I see what I'm feeling. But pause for a moment. Who or what is seeing it? This is not just philosophy. This is the very edge of human awareness. The blurry border between you and the world, between experience and ownership. And Buddhism has a radically liberating answer. Welcome to Stillness Unfolded. In today's journey, we're going to peel back the layers of the self, the one who watches, the one who narrates, the one who claims to be you. We'll challenge the stories your mind tells, the illusions your language creates, and the quiet traps that even seasoned meditators fall into. But this won't be a debate. It's a journey of seeing, directly, clearly, honestly, not to replace one belief with another, but to uncover what lies beneath when all beliefs fall away. So ask yourself, if the thoughts aren't you, and even awareness is not yours, who's left? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Phantom Behind the Curtain. You sit down, close your eyes, and follow your breath. Inhale. Exhale. A quiet stillness begins to form. Then, almost out of nowhere, a voice arises in your mind. I am watching my breath. It sounds innocent, even spiritual. But this is where the illusion quietly begins. Not with what is seen, but with the sense that someone must be seeing it. The human mind is deeply conditioned to seek a subject behind every experience. If there is movement, there must be a mover. If there are thoughts, there must be a thinker. And if there's awareness, there must be an entity doing the observing. This logic seems airtight, but only if we fail to examine it. In early Buddhist teachings, the Buddha dismantled this assumption with radical simplicity. He didn't propose a new metaphysical theory to replace the old. Instead, he invited us to look directly. Is there truly someone behind the thought, or is there just a thought? When joy arises, does it belong to anyone? Or is it simply a momentary appearance? We often say, I am thinking, as if thought is the product of some inner engineer, constantly turning the gears of consciousness. But if you watch closely, you'll realize thought simply happens. Without warning, without your command, without your consent. You don't choose your next thought. It arises on its own, like a wave in the ocean. That's where the illusion lives, not in the thought itself, but in the invisible leap from thought to ownership. I'm thinking, I'm observing, I'm aware. Each of these phrases reinforces a deeper lie, that there's an I separate from the experience. But what if all of it, the thought, the feeling, the witnessing, is part of the same unfolding event? Modern neuroscience has a surprising agreement here. Researchers have discovered that a specific part of the brain, the default mode network, is active when we're lost in inner narrative. It becomes quiet when we are simply present. This part of the brain helps string together memories, plans, worries, and self-images. It creates a continuity, a sense that there's a stable you behind it all. But when neuroscientists look for the self in the brain, they find no command center, no homunculus, no tiny person in a control room, just patterns, neural firings, electrical signals flowing from one region to another, consciousness without a controller. The Buddha, 2,500 years earlier, said it in a different language. There is thinking, but no thinker is found. This was not nihilism. It was freedom, a pointing out instruction that the sense of me was not a fixed identity, but a mental formation, one of many. But here's the catch. Awareness does feel real. You're hearing these words. You feel the body sitting. You perceive sensations. So, if there's no one watching, who is aware? This is where the Buddha turned to metaphor. He didn't define awareness as a thing. He likened it to a mirror, utterly clear, utterly impartial. The mirror reflects everything placed in front of it. A smile, a frown, a storm, a sunrise. But it doesn't hold on to any of it. It doesn't say, this is mine. It reflects, then releases. So too with pure awareness. It knows, but it doesn't cling. It perceives, but it doesn't possess. It allows every sensation, thought, memory to arise and dissolve, without ever becoming entangled in them. But our language, our habits of speech and thought, pulls us back into identity. I am the one meditating. I am the one being present. Even spiritual practice becomes another role the ego quietly adopts. So, we must ask, Is there truly someone behind awareness? Or is awareness simply present, unclaimed, ownerless, effortless? The real challenge isn't that there is no self. It's that the illusion of one is so convincing. It's stitched into every sentence we speak, every thought we believe, every story we tell about who we are and how life works. That's why the Buddha didn't ask us to believe in no self. He asked us to see, not to reject the feeling of identity, but to watch how it is constructed, moment by moment, condition by condition, to observe how it arises and how it passes. And in that gentle, precise observation, the illusion begins to dissolve. The phantom behind the curtain was never a being. It was a habit, and habits can be broken, not by force, but by clarity. Chapter 2. The Watcher Watching the Watcher. A wave of emotion rises. Anger, perhaps. It burns hot in your chest, tightens your jaw, quickens your heartbeat. And almost automatically, the mind labels it, "I'm angry." This seems like a simple observation, but in that tiny phrase lies a powerful illusion, one so subtle, we rarely notice it. The Buddha taught that anger is not a solid thing. It's not a possession. It's not even yours. It is, instead, a shifting dance of conditions, bodily sensations, rapid thoughts, hormonal surges, memories igniting like dry leaves. When we say, "I'm angry," we're mistaking a storm for a statue, treating a process like an object. But it gets more deceptive. You catch the anger, and something inside you steps back. Another voice arises, quieter, more refined. "I'm aware that I'm angry." It feels like progress. It feels like consciousness has expanded. Now you're not just lost in the emotion, you're watching it. You're outside it. But are you? This is where the illusion deepens. The mind has now created a second layer, an internal commentator, a subtle self that claims the act of observation. It whispers, "See, I am not the anger. I am the one watching it." And again, the structure of language betrays us. I am watching. The ego hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed masks. Many spiritual seekers stop here. They feel a sense of clarity, distance, and peace. They say, "Now I have found my true self, the witness, the silent observer." But Buddhism, especially in its deeper psychological teachings like the Abhidhamma, peels back even this. The observer, too, is a mental event. It seems steady, but it shifts. It feels central, but it arises and fades like everything else. Just as waves don't direct the sea, this witness does not control awareness. It is part of the stream, not separate from it. Here's the trap. Once the mind constructs the idea of a pure, spiritual self, it clings. Even meditators who've spent decades in silence fall into this illusion. They've stopped identifying with anger, joy, fear, but now they identify with the one who sees those things. It feels noble, but it's still clinging. This is the watcher watching the watcher. The recursive loop of ego. Let's make it more vivid. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. Behind you, another mirror. Now imagine the infinite reflection of yourself. One version watching the next, watching the next, watching the next. It feels endless, but it's all one illusion. There's no final you at the end of that tunnel. Just images, just echoes. In the same way, when you say, "I see that I am watching," you're creating layers, not depth. You're still moving within the same mental structure. The scenery has changed. The script has matured, but the play goes on. So what does Buddhism offer instead? Not a new identity, not a more subtle version of self, but freedom from the entire game. Rather than replacing one I with another, it invites you to observe how these identities arise, and more importantly, how they pass. Noticing the thought, "I'm angry," followed by, "I'm watching that I'm angry," followed by asterisk, "I'm aware of the watcher," and then pausing. Don't follow, don't build, just see. Each layer is just a ripple in the mind. It may be calm or chaotic, but it's still movement. And every movement, no matter how refined, is impermanent. The ocean doesn't become more itself by creating waves. It is itself before, during, and after the waves. This is the insight that breaks the loop, the realization that the witness is not a destination, but just another moment. One more conditioned event, mistaken for something timeless. It's not about denying awareness. It's about letting go of the need to own it. As long as there's a grasping at, "I am the observer," there is tension. Subtle, yes, but tension nonetheless. Because you're still holding on, still trying to locate a stable place in a fluid world. But awareness, in its true nature, doesn't need anchoring. It doesn't claim. It doesn't name. It doesn't perform. It just reveals. There's a phrase in Zen that captures this beautifully. The wild geese do not intend to cast their reflection. The water has no mind to receive their image. In the same way, awareness does not seek identity. It simply reflects what is. And that reflection, unclaimed, centerless, is where true peace begins. But to reach it, we must be willing to let go of even the most sacred idea, that there's a self who is watching. Because even the watcher is just another cloud drifting through the sky of mind. Chapter 3, the mind's oldest magic trick. The most convincing illusions are the ones we don't know we're under. And the mind? It's a master magician, performing its greatest trick long before we know there's even a stage. This trick doesn't involve deception in the usual sense. There's no lie told outright, no manipulative whisper. It's much more subtle than that. The illusion of self is not shouted, it's implied. And it begins with the simplest materials: memory, language, and time. Think about it. From the moment you were a child, the world has mirrored an identity back to you. Your name, your face in the mirror, praise for being a good boy, a smart girl, a brave one. And so, like a snowball rolling down a hill, the identity began to build. Each memory added a layer. Each habit carved a deeper groove. Over time, all these conditioned fragments began to weave into something more persistent, a sense of continuity, of me. Not just a body or a collection of thoughts, but a central character in a lifelong story. You became the protagonist of your own novel, the narrator, the actor, and the one the plot revolves around. But the Buddha gently pointed to something profound. Just because a story feels coherent doesn't mean it's real in the way you think. Let's slow this down. When you remember an event from your childhood, let's say your first time riding a bicycle, you're not replaying a live recording. You're reconstructing. Your memory is patchwork, a mix of images, emotions, and stories you've told yourself 100 times. And as neuroscience confirms, each time you recall it, you're not retrieving the same memory, you're recreating it, editing, reinforcing. In other words, the self is constantly being updated, not uncovered. This leads us to the first trap, the story trap. The mind, by its very nature, is a storyteller. It doesn't just perceive, it narrates. And in that narration, it inserts a me. I felt humiliated. I was betrayed. I learned to be stronger. These stories aren't meaningless. They shape behavior, values, survival. But the danger lies in forgetting their stories. Not because they're untrue, but because they're incomplete. They suggest a fixed identity behind every event, when in truth, there is only change. Now the second trap, the language trap. Language is our most powerful tool and our most dangerous illusion. Think about how you describe your experience. I am tired. I am anxious. I am broken. Each phrase carries a hidden assumption that there's an I who possesses tiredness, anxiety, brokenness, that these are properties of a permanent self. But what if we shift the language? Try instead, tiredness is present. Anxiety is arising. Sadness is unfolding. Feel the difference? The moment we drop ownership, a doorway opens. Experience is no longer something mine, it is something happening. And when that happens, suffering becomes lighter. Not gone, but no longer fused with identity. This shift in language mirrors a core insight in Buddhism, anatta, the absence of a permanent self. It's not a belief, but an invitation to look again, to speak from the truth of change, rather than the illusion of control. But there's a third, and most deceptive, trap, the spiritual self. This is where the illusion gets elegant. You've disidentified from the thoughts. You've stepped back from emotions. You've even watched the watcher. Now the mind says, this is my true nature. The still presence. The quiet witness behind it all. And it feels true. It feels serene, unshakable, even holy. But the Buddha warned, even this is a formation, a mental image, a refined version of self. It's the ego dressed in spiritual robes. And it clings. Because the idea of a pure inner witness is comforting. It gives us something to hold on to when everything else changes. It allows us to feel safe in the storm. But clinging, no matter how noble the object, is still clinging. and clinging is the root of suffering. The path of liberation doesn't end in finding a higher self. It ends in seeing that no self needs to be found. That awareness doesn't need an owner to function. That life can unfold beautifully, mysteriously, without a controller behind the scenes. The Zen tradition captures this in a phrase both shocking and freeing. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It doesn't mean to disrespect the Buddha. It means, if you create an idea of the Buddha, if you cling to an image of truth, even a spiritual one, you've already strayed from it. Let go of even your highest concepts. Because the mind's oldest magic trick is not just creating a self. It's creating a self out of the very act of letting go. It says, I am the one who has transcended ego. I am the one who is purely present. I am the enlightened one. And with that, the illusion resets. The ego sneaks in through the back door. So what do? We see, moment by moment, layer by layer, not with rejection, not with judgment, but with curiosity, like watching a magician up close, until the trick loses its power. And what remains? Not a self, not even a no-self. Just this, the breath, the body, the space between thoughts. Awareness, clean, silent, unclaimed. And that, the Buddha taught, is where freedom begins. Chapter 4, The Final Disappearance. There comes a point on the path where even the subtlest constructs begin to loosen. The beliefs you wore like armor start to feel heavy. The roles you once played, student, seeker, even observer of the self, begin to blur. Not because something's wrong, but because something deeper is waking up, a knowing that doesn't need an identity to see clearly. You sit in silence. Thoughts rise and pass. Feelings ripple through the body. A breeze brushes your skin. Awareness is present. Yet, as you rest here, a strange realization begins to form. There's no one doing the resting. The stillness is not being achieved. It's not being produced by effort or held together by will. It's just there. No watcher. No one owning the experience. No internal narrator taking notes. Just presence. This is the moment where many turn back. The absence of a center can feel like an existential void, like standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing to hold. But what if it's not a cliff? What if it's space itself, open, non-threatening, quietly alive? The Buddha spoke of this not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived experience. He used the term tatthata, suchness. It's not a thing, not a concept, not even an achievement. It is the felt truth of reality as it is, before naming, before clinging. You see, the self was never a villain. It was a tool, a useful fiction that helped us navigate relationships, danger, daily life. But tools are not meant to be mistaken for reality. You don't bring a raft with you after crossing the river. You don't carry the map once you've arrived at the mountain. And you don't need the self once you've seen through its necessity. This is not annihilation. It's liberation. The Buddha didn't destroy the idea of the self. He simply revealed that it was never there in the way we imagined. What we called I was just a chain of conditioned moments. Events are rising and falling, based on contact, perception, memory, habit, but no entity at the center holding them together. This is the mystery that many traditions point to, but few explain. Awareness does not belong to anyone. It simply is. It's not yours. It's not mine. It doesn't come with a label or a title. It doesn't ask to be owned or defended. It is the mirror before the image appears. And here's what's remarkable. Once the idea of ownership dissolves, everything softens. Suffering, once so personal, becomes more like weather, passing, temporary, not yours to manage. Fear, once so gripping, loses its teeth. Even joy becomes quieter, no longer something to cling to or replicate, but something to welcome as it comes, and to release as it goes. So what happens when the sense of I disappears? What's left? Not nothing, but something wordless. Something simple, silent, and utterly immediate. Like the hush before a bird takes flight. Like the warmth of sun on skin with no one to claim it. Like the sky, holding clouds and storms and sunlight alike, but never becoming any of them. You see, it was never about erasing your existence. It was about recognizing what was never yours to begin with. And with that insight, a deep peace arrives. Not dramatic, not loud. It doesn't crash in like revelation. It blooms like a flower, quietly, inevitably, beautifully. You no longer need to be someone to live. You simply live. You respond. You listen. You breathe. You laugh. You grieve. But without dragging an identity into every moment. Even modern science, again, echoes this. Neuroscientific studies show that when people enter deep states of non-dual awareness, where the idea of self temporarily fades, the default mode network in the brain slows. Mental chatter ceases. There's less projection, less narrative making. And instead, there's more connection, more attunement, more presence. Ironically, when you no longer cling to being someone, you begin to meet life more fully. Not as a persona, but as awareness itself, flowing, shifting, dancing with what is. This is what the Buddha meant when he said that awakening is not something to be added. It is the shedding of what was never yours. It's not becoming something greater. It's seeing clearly what has always been. A stillness that doesn't belong to you. A silence that requires no speaker. A truth so immediate that even the word truth feels too heavy. And when a thought appears again, who is experiencing this? You don't rush to answer. You just smile gently, like someone who has heard the punchline to a very old joke. Because now you know. There's no one to hold the experience. There's just experience unfolding. And somehow, that's not emptiness. That's wholeness. Chapter 5, Living Without a Watcher. So what happens when the illusion is gone? When the phantom self quietly dissolves, not in a blaze of mystical fire, but like fog lifting in the morning sun. You might expect silence, emptiness, a kind of spiritual vacuum. But instead, what arises is startling in its simplicity. Life. Unfiltered. Immediate. Free. You still wake up. You still go to work. You still drink coffee, argue with friends, misplace your keys, cry at old songs. But something fundamental has shifted, not in what happens, but in how it happens. Because now, there's no one struggling to hold it all together. No inner manager frantically narrating your worth, defending your identity, explaining every emotion. The pressure to be someone in every moment, it's gone. And in its place, breath, sensation, color, movement, being. The rain no longer falls on you. It just falls. Sadness doesn't mean you are broken. It just arises and passes like clouds overhead. Even joy is no longer your joy. It's just joy, full and fleeting, a gift that doesn't need to be grasped. Living without a watcher doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean you forget your name, stop paying bills, or reject your responsibilities. The body-mind continues, speaking, choosing, relating. But the weight of me behind every action is gone. And with that, suffering loses its anchor. Because suffering, as the Buddha taught, doesn't arise from pain alone. It arises from identification. From the story that says, this is happening to me. This is my failure. This is my shame. This is my success. But what if pain was just pain? What if confusion was just confusion? Not proof that you are lost, but simply a cloud passing through the mind. When the watcher falls away, so does personalization. And when things are no longer personal, they become workable. You no longer fight your feelings. You meet them. You no longer resist your experience. You participate in it. This is not detachment. This is intimacy. For the first time, you're not distanced from life by the commentary of a self. You are in it, open, receptive, and oddly light. And in that lightness, compassion blooms. Because the more clearly you see that you are not a fixed self, the more clearly you see that no one else is either. You no longer judge others based on roles, appearances, or behaviors alone, because you understand that they, too, are waves in motion. That behind the harsh word or desperate act is a human being caught in the same illusion you once believed in. And that changes everything. You no longer need to fix everyone. You no longer need to fix yourself. You simply meet each moment with presence, with care, with awareness. Not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because there's no one left to protect. No ego to defend. No identity to maintain. Just the natural unfolding of things, seen clearly, felt fully, lived freely. The Buddha often spoke of his teachings as a raft, a tool to cross to the far shore. But once you arrive, he said, you don't carry the raft on your back. You let it go. The same goes for the teachings about self, awareness, even liberation itself. They're here to guide. But once the river has been crossed, there's only this: stillness, openness, presence. And if the question returns, but who is living this life? Let it return, but don't follow it. Let it echo like a bell whose sound fades gently into silence. That silence isn't empty. It's alive. It is the sound of life without a watcher. And somehow it's enough. If you've made it this far, you've walked through layers of illusion, peeled back the masks of the mind, and arrived at something beyond answers. There's no need to hold on to ideas, not even the idea of freedom. Just notice. Breathe. Let life unfold without the need to own it. And if the mind asks again, "But who am I, really?" Let that question float like a feather on the surface of still water. No need to answer. Just rest in the space before the question arose. Because sometimes, what you truly are is not what's seen, but the seeing itself. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this video stirred something within you, helped you pause, or made you question a little more gently, consider subscribing to Stillness Unfolded. Leave a comment below and share your reflection. Your insight may become someone else's turning point. Until next time, keep watching, not from behind the eyes, but from the place where even the watcher disappears.